In the last video, we talked about the most beautiful places in the world that you must visit. And today we will tell you about places where probably you would not want to go. The scariest places in our world. Paveglia is a small island located between Venice and Lido in the Venetian lagoon of northern Italy. Paveglia wasn't always an evil place where unspeakable horrors happened. The island is mentioned in documents dating back to 421 and was a flourishing economic center with a growing population up until 1378. During the War of Chioggia, the people of Paveglia, called Pavegliodi, were evacuated to Venice. When the war was finally over in 1381, Paveglia lay in total devastation and only a few dozen inhabitants were able to return home. In the second half of the 16th century, Europe was engulfed in an epidemic of bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, which spread very quickly, and there was simply nowhere to put the dead and dying people. The authorities of Venice made a decision that was understandable at that time. It was ordered to bring to Paveglia not only the corpses of those who died from the plague, but also all those who showed the slightest signs of illness. It is easy to imagine what the island has turned into, where, for several years, infected corpses mixed with still living people were burned on huge bonfires. According to historical documents, more than 160,000 people died on Paveglia at that time. In 1776, the island came under the jurisdiction of the Magistrato alla Sanità, public health office, and became a checkpoint for all goods and people coming to and going from Venice by ship. In 1793, there were several cases of the plague on 2 ships, and consequently the island was transformed into a temporary confinement station for the ill, Lazaretto. The island was used as a quarantine station from 1793 until 1814. In 1922, the existing buildings were converted into an asylum for the mentally ill and later used as a nursing home, long-term care facility, until its closure in 1968. In 1922, a new beginning was at hand for the grieving island. This time as an asylum. Mussolini had just come to power and the fascist ideology was fresh and strong. At first, the asylum probably functioned as such, but within a few years, the path went in another direction. The urge to protect the nation and protect the race brought a medical surgeon with a particular interest in racial biology to the hospital. He was an eager follower of the new disciplines, and soon he started doing experiments on the patients. Lobotomy. People say they could hear the men and women scream on silent summer nights. In those days there were no anesthetics, and since the patients were all mad, no particular precautions were called upon. And lobotomy includes drilling and sawing. The story of the doctor ended in 1942. During all the years from 1922 and onward, the patients, as well as the nurses and other doctors, had complained about strange movements, lights, and voices. But as the patients were mentally ill, nobody cared what they said. It all ended in 1942 when the head surgeon completely lost his mind. Screaming as if assaulted by someone or something, he rushed to the old bell tower. There he ran up the old and disintegrating staircase all the way to the top and threw himself out of a broken window. This is the story of Tiny Island, which keeps so many secrets. I don't know about you, but me, this place terrifier. If it will ever be open for tourists, don't think I will be on of them. Would you go to this place? Built in 1898, this disused hospital complex of approximately 60 buildings located in the district of Belitz-Heilstaden. Between 1898 and 1930, the complex served as a sanatorium for lung diseases, generally housing those with then fatal conditions such as tuberculosis. During World War I, it served as a military field hospital of the Imperial German Army. It was in late 1916 that Adolf Hitler was admitted to Belitz-Heilstaden after being wounded in the leg at the Battle of the Somme. It was used once again as a field hospital to treat wounded Nazis during World War II. Occupied by the Russians in 1945, it served as a Soviet military hospital for the next 50 years until 1995, long after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The hospital treated everyone from Communist Party members to the disgraced head of the East German government who was sent there after being forced out in 1990. A walk through abandoned buildings is very dangerous because they haven't been restored for more than 70 years and may collapse at any moment. However, there are always lots of those wishing to take a walk through the old buildings. It's not easy to find an entrance to the building. All windows and doors are securely boarded up. Anyway, they do not represent a serious obstacle for those who like walk in eerie places. After getting into one of the abandoned buildings, you can walk through the old chambers and deserted corridors, see the remains of the medical equipment and rusted beds where patients were resting. The Abandoned Sanatorium in Germany is said to be haunted by all those souls that died inside of it because of its dark history. And in the Belitz-Heilstätten hospital, it wasn't just sick people who ended up dying, but several murders took place in it or around it as well. After the Soviet left, it became a hotspot for satanic and occult people to gather to drink and keep seances. And it was also those with an even more sinister idea. In March 1991, a mother and her newborn child of 3 months were brutally murdered right outside the old sanatorium. It was the Beast of Belitz who had struck again, a notorious serial killer that had started on 24 October in 1989. The conservation status of the countless corpses exposed make the cemetery of the convent of the Capuchin friars, known as the Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo, one of the most impressive places to visit in the world. The foundation of the Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo dates back to 1599, when the friars decided to build a cemetery more suited to their needs. Until that year, they buried their brothers in a mass grave, lowering the bodies from above with a sheet. In 1597, the friars decided to create a larger underground cemetery by digging a room behind the high altar of the Church of Santa Maria della Pace. While moving the bodies, they noticed that 45 bodies were left almost intact, mummified of course. The friars decided not to bury them, but to display them upright in niches built in the newly excavated corridor. Over the years, interest in these mummies grew, and in 1783 the Capuchins decided to grant burial to all those who could afford the cost of embalming. Rich people wanted to remain in their status of dignity and power, so mummification became a status symbol, a possibility for the families of the deceased to see and venerate the body of their relatives in a not ordinary way. The halls of the catacombs are divided by category. The categories are men, women, virgins, children, priests, monks, and professionals. The catacombs are said to hold 8,000 bodies, but the number is probably closer to 2,000, some of them quite notable. Rumor has it that celebrated writer of the novel The Leopard, Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa is here, but his body is actually buried at the nearby cemetery. There are members of the Sicilian aristocracy, lawyers, doctors, artists, and even the son of a Tunisian king inside, their preserved bodies dressed in clothes they wore in life resting for eternity below the streets of Palermo. The embalming procedure, which was lost for decades, consists of formalin to kill bacteria, alcohol to dry the body, glycerin to keep her from overdrying, salicylic acid to kill fungi, and the most important ingredient, zinc salts to give the body rigidity. This is a place where the living meet the dead. One of the most recent to be interred was Rosalia Lombardo, only 2 years old when she was embalmed in 1920. The embalming procedure has kept Rosalia looking so well preserved that she has been dubbed Sleeping Beauty. St. George's Church in Lukova is definitely one of the spookiest places in the Czech Republic, maybe even in the world. After being abandoned by locals who believed the church was haunted, an artist's installation has enhanced St. George's reputation internationally by giving its ghosts an earthly form. St. George's Church gained a reputation for being haunted when its roof fell on the faithful who had come to attend a funeral in 1968. almost 32 victims in total. This ill omen led local residents to hold church services outside, rather than venturing into the supposedly cursed interior of the building, which was consecrated in 1352. The people of the village of Lukova saw this tragedy as a grim omen and never returned to the church again. Because of their fear of the curse, for 30 years St. George left and never visited by citizens. The result, the place is increasingly filled with strange myths and shunned by society. Having never been visited, the remaining building conditions look even scarier. Here and there, the moss had started popping up on the walls and the floor was already covered with cracks. More than 50 years after the events, while the church building is still under threat of destruction, a Czech artist came up with the idea of placing 32 statues of figures draped in plaster on the pews that were left as they were. Each ghost of this past represents a faithful person who came to pray before the 1968 tragedy. It was the artist Jakub Hadrava who had the idea of reviving these ghosts of a bygone era. The plaster statues occupy the benches, their heads bowed as if they were in full contemplation or meditation. These statues represent wandering souls who have not found rest after the drama. Despite having a very dark history, St. George Church is now transformed into a place that can be visited by tourists. However, for those who do not know its history, it would be a shudder to see the location because of the artist's mystical idea. Local responses to the art installation have been positive, not least because of the boost which it brought to tourism as well as to the fortunes of the previously derelict church. Others, however, have described the presence of the ghosts as oddly calming, bringing an added sense of peace and repose to the ancient building. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, it is quite possible that you will not enter a church in the same way after having seen this art exhibit and this church still so alive. "65 feet beneath the lively streets of Paris lies what is perhaps the City of Light's unlikeliest attraction. Not for the faint of heart, the Catacombs de Paris are home to the bones of over 6 million late Parisians. Its narrow subterranean passageways date back to the 13th century, when they were used to mine the limestone that helped build the city. By the late 18th century, these old quarries were beginning to collapse under the weight of a rapidly expanding Paris. At the same time, the cemeteries at the center French capital were faced with overcrowding. The catacombs were seen as a solution that would solve both problems. To solve the problem of relocating the remains of millions of people from less innocence, city planners and officials had to get creative. They identified a vast network of underground limestone quarries on the left bank, much of them then outside the bounds of Paris, as an ideal place to store the remains of millions of Parisians. So, beginning in 1785 and carrying through the following year, the city undertook a first major evacuation of remains from charnel houses and mass graves at less innocence. The transfers were completed at night in an attempt to fend off criticism or shock from residents and church officials. Workers heaped bones into quarry wells, then piled them in the galleries of old subterranean quarries. The site, near modern-day Montparnasse, was deemed the Paris Municipal Ossuary in 1786. In later decades and following the French Revolution, other graveyards and cemeteries in the city center were exhumed, with more remains transferred to the catacombs. The project significantly picked up after 1840, as Haussmann's and others' efforts to modernize the city picked up significant speed. Moving old remains underground into the mines prevented them from collapse and eased crowding at the cemeteries. During World War II, when Germany occupied France, the French resistance took advantage of the catacombs below their capital and used them as hideouts, since the underground tunnels and hidden pathways made for the perfect hiding spot. The catacombs have been a site of fascination ever since they opened in the early 19th century and remain open today as one of the city's most unique attractions. Due to their extensive depth, the catacombs cannot be fully explored. In fact, many areas within it have restricted access and are difficult to get to. The part open to the public is called the Denfert Rochereau Ossuary, which forms a small area of the entire catacomb network. However, there is a community of enthusiasts who like exploring the catacombs called cataphiles. They frequently traverse them as much as they can, sometimes even exploring the parts blocked off, not open to the public. Please note that these parts are not safe and should not be explored. During the French Revolution, Philibert Aspert, a doorman porter at the Val-de-Grâce military hospital, accidentally entered the catacombs through the staircase that was in the hospital's courtyard and got lost below. He couldn't be found for years until a group of cataphiles found him 11 years later, albeit dead. In fact, tragically, his body was found near an exit, which proves that Philibert was close to escaping from the tunnels. He was buried in the same place he was found, with the tombstone inscription describing the tragic incident. And while you can't see his burial place since it's in the restricted area of the catacombs, it's still important to know about this tragic incident. Hashima Island is a small unoccupied island right in front of the Japanese coast, about 9.5 miles or 15 kilometers from Nagasaki. The island is nicknamed Battleship Island because of its shape, and it has been abandoned for several years. But abandoned does not mean empty, because the ghosts of the past have taken over the island and its buildings. Mitsubishi conglomerate purchased Hashima Island along with 2 neighboring islands for more extensive undersea coal extraction. By 1941, Hashima Island alone produced 410,000 tons of coal. In total, there were 30 concrete buildings compactly erected on this tiny piece of land where one could walk between any 2 points on the island in less than it took to finish a cigarette, creating a labyrinth of corridors and staircases connect all the apartment blocks. The buildings were built by Korean and Chinese prisoners who were forced to work here from 1930 to just after World War II. The conditions of these forced laborers were hard, and some never made it back home. The people who worked here named the island Jail Island, or even Hell Island. Following the outbreak of World War II, a total of 41,000 Chinese laborers were forcefully shipped to Japan, 3,765 of who were sent to Hashima Island. They were forced to dig for coal on the island, undergoing humiliation and cruelty. Fed with residues, the skinny Chinese laborers looked like living skeletons. However, they still had to work in the dark and hot undersea coal mine. Island was fenced with high concrete walls like a giant prison. And indeed, it was a giant prison. Many of the laborers tried to escape, but only fell into the sea and drowned. Some of them even committed suicide because they could not stand the humiliation. By the end of World War II, a total of 722 Chinese and 1,442 Korean laborers had been tortured to death on the island. In 1970s, the Japanese government officially shut down the coal mine on the island after a worldwide campaign to replace coal with petroleum. Hashima Island, measuring only 160 meters by 480 meters in land area, quickly developed alongside the coal mining operation. In 1959, the population reached a total of 5,259, recording history's highest population density to this day. High-rise residences, schools, hospitals, movie theaters, swimming pools, and even shrines were built on Hashima's grounds. However, in 1974, the island became completely deserted after the coal mine was closed. In 2015, Hashima Island was registered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, listed as a component of Sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, iron and steel, shipbuilding, and coal mining industries. Hashima Island is a famously haunted spot in Japan. The Island of the Dolls, La Isla de las Muñecas, is a chinampa of the Laguna de Tequila located in the channels of Xochimilco, south of the center of Mexico City, Mexico. Notable for the number of dolls of various styles and colors that can be found throughout the islands, it has become a popular tourist attraction. No humans live here on this island, only dolls. They hang from ceilings, trees, boats moored on the shore. The dolls have made this island their home since 1950 when, according to local folklore, a child fell into the water from a chinampa, an artificial island built on fresh water for agricultural purposes. A local man known as Don Julian Santana jumped in to save her, but the child died from drowning. Don Julian claimed to have heard the girl screaming from beyond the grave, "I want my doll." Sure enough, near where her body was supposedly found, he found a doll, which he then hung up on a tree as if to make an offering to the young girl's spirit. Don Julian became both obsessed and haunted by her. When Don Julian's crops failed, he placed more dolls around the island in an effort to appease the young girl's restless spirit. This macabre shrine became his obsession. Don Julian spent every single day scouring rubbish dumps and fishing in the canals for old, discarded dolls. He even used to trade his vegetables for them. Don Julian hung the dolls up in the various states of disrepair he found them in, which, along with their exposure to the elements, created the terrifying scene we see today. Don Julian passed away in 2001, close to the spot where the young girl had died. He met the same fate as her and drowned. Many believe his death was caused by the girl's spirit, which is said to still haunt the island to this day. Locals believe that the girl's spirit possesses the dolls and causes them to move their arms, open their eyes, and move their heads. Other witnesses swear that they've heard the dolls speaking to one another. It remains as one of the most off-the-beaten-path destinations in Bulgaria, and one of the coolest things to do in the Balkans. And no wonder why. Almost destroyed, shaped like a spaceship, it's wonderful and terrifier in the same time. Welcome to Bulgarian UFO Ship. There is no other peak, no alternative piece of the native land so intensely linked to the breakthrough times for the Bulgarian nation. Mount Sustainer of the Bulgarian spirit, preserving heroic grandeur and glory of the revolutionary traditions of the Bulgarian societies and the Bulgarian Communist Party. Here are found the three revolutionary eras, three generations of fighters for national and social liberation, Noev, 1989. The spaceship-like structure, known as Paveglia, was constructed in the 1970s and served as the seat of the Bulgarian Socialist Party until communism thawed in 1990. The interior space of the monument was decorated with richly detailed mosaics, which illustrated an allegorical history of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Bucolic scenes of collective farming and the faces of students, scientists, and cosmonauts appeared alongside depictions of wartime anti-fascist struggles. In one particularly striking panel, communist workers were pictured driving their pitchforks into a serpent symbolic of foreign capitalism. Covering 510 square meters, these mosaics were formed from 35 tons of cobalt glass, or smalt, imported from Ukraine. Maybe the communists planned go other planet with this thing, or maybe worse. They came with this spaceship from other galaxy. This would explain a lot. You must agree with me, this view is incredible. When the cloud covers this building, it looks like UFO just landed. The look of Georgy Stoilov's Paveglia monument was influenced by the brutalist style which been popular in that time in Western Europe. He wanted to create a timeless monument by incorporating both ancient and futuristic motifs into his design. He lists the sci-fi films of the 1950s amongst his inspirations for Paveglia. The circular form appealed to him also as it seemed to symbolize infinity, and thus echoed the popular communist theme of building an eternal future, eternal glory.